So in a previous lecture, we discussed how difficult it is for scholars of communication and those interested in determining whether or not persuasion is effective to measure the outcomes of persuasion. We can't exactly follow people to the ballot box to know whether an election campaign commercial is the reason they voted for that candidate or not. And so when faced with questioning whether or not people are persuaded by a particular message, scholars of communication might ask whether social marketing campaigns even have to actually lead to a behavioral change. According to a lot of the research, social marketing campaigns do not actually lead to behavioral change directly. Instead, if we think about most social marketing campaigns, they're designed not to actually influence your daily behaviors or routines, but instead to get you to think differently in the future or slowly inoculate an idea that might open you up to something you hadn't previously considered. Recall the Smokey the Bear campaign. Well, while Smokey the Bear certainly doesn't want you to start forest fires, the average message is for those individuals who are going to be lighting campfires or otherwise engaged in outdoor activities which might not be its daily audience. However, by inoculating those messages and presenting them as often as they did in the early 80s and 90s, they've presented an effective social marketing campaign tailored not to get individuals to purchase a product or even to change their daily behaviors, but to get them to think differently about forest safety and about the need to prevent wildfires through their own actions. So social marketing campaigns can be about influencing attitudes, and in this sense they can be about keeping individuals from doing a certain behavior. Right now we're seeing a considerable amount of attention played towards things like single-use plastics and the need to prevent our use of single-use plastics. So things like banning plastic straws are an ongoing advocacy campaign. Well, that effort to ban plastic straws is an effort to keep individuals from doing something. Well, in that regard, it is an influence campaign rather than a behavioral change campaign, and the hope is that by influencing individuals' attitudes enough, it will lead to behavioral change in the future. The likelihood that a single commercial or a single example of a sea turtle's harm is going to be enough to persuade everybody is small. But as that example gets repeated, as those narratives become retold, they become increasingly powerful. And it's not just that campaigns are for things that we should otherwise avoid and prevent, like single-use plastics. It's also that campaigns can be used to promote positive behaviors. You might think about campaigns that encourage people to otherwise recycle, to be kinder to others, to share with others more often. Those would all be instances of social campaigns that promote not necessarily a change in negative behaviors, but a continuation of positive behaviors. It might be helpful to return to our previous lecture on social judgment theory and consider the way that social judgment theory defined and understands attitudes as those beliefs that we have anchored along a continuum. It then considers speakers' job, who are making an effort to persuade their audience, having the goal to move those anchors along that continuum of belief scale. From that latitude of rejection, heck no, no chance, to that latitude of consideration, maybe, I'm interested, finally to that latitude of action or persuasion, you've got me, I believe you, and how do I sign up to do more? That continuum of persuasion posited by social judgment theory is helpful to better understand attitudes in the way that attitudes are defined as an evaluative judgment or an understanding that we have about an object that associates some sense of favor or disfavor, pleasure, enjoyment, or distaste and disenjoyment. In social marketing campaigns, one of the main focuses is often on changing individuals' attitudes to guide their behavior towards future decisions. So in this sense, one of the postulates behind every effective social marketing campaign is that by changing individuals' attitudes, you change their subsequent behavior. Oftentimes this involves repeated exposure and a sophisticated campaign. If you choose to detail a social marketing campaign for your upcoming fact campaign paper and your associated outline argument, I would encourage you to think about the way that a social marketing campaign markets not just directly to its stakeholders that are most obviously involved, but also how it effectively markets upwards to stakeholders who aren't directly associated with the issue. In this sense, you might think about the way that it does what's called upstream mobilization. I think upstream mobilization is a fascinating concept that you might be able to explore more in your own individual time if you're interested in talking about something like this in a potential job interview. The idea of upstream mobilization is that those like ourselves who are effective communicators and adept at building skilled messages and resources can design those things in ways that don't just get the individuals most obviously affected, but also implicate those other audience stakeholders who, by being aware of their position, might be able to do more to help. Here's a sort of related example. I wanted to get my dad to get a health checkup because I was concerned that as he was getting older and he was neglecting his regular checkups and care from his medical providers, that could cause him some future concerns. Preventative medicine has been shown to be quite helpful. And so I told my dad that if he were to pass away or otherwise get sick from anything, I would tell his future children that it was because he hadn't been taking care of himself. And so in that sense, I threatened his future legacy. I would suggest doctors who are interested in increasing their patients, especially in the age range of my dad, in many ways curmudgeons and stubbornly old men who refuse to get medical treatment, might, rather than advertise towards those stubborn men who might not want to see the advertisement, instead advertise towards their children. And so by marketing towards their children, you might actually mobilize the parents. In this regard, there's an upstream mobilization effect happening. By reaching out to those audiences indirectly affected, myself and the parent, or rather the children of these parents, to mobilize their parents indirectly, you achieve a persuasive effect by virtue of the actions of those children or other audiences. And so upstream mobilization is an effective technique to mobilize new audiences into social marketing campaigns. Upstream marketing campaigns have been shown to be considerably more effective because they tend to bring in a wider circle of influence, tend to involve decision makers rather than just those directly affected. If well conducted, they can include a number of different community partners in ways that yield new strengths, and often can include a different number of associated businesses that might include greater numbers of economic profit potentials for all. And of course, they better include or represent the government laws and existing government agencies or enforcement agencies that allow the various forms of upstream mobilization to persist and to permeate. And so in this sense, if we think about successful social marketing campaigns, they're often enabled or supported by existing laws, legislation, community partners, and decision makers or people who are already invested stakeholders. I want to briefly return to the model of communication that you might be familiar with. We often, as communication experts, talk about a trichotomy of persuasion, focusing on something like the sender, the message, and the receiver. However, when we focus only on sender, message, and receiver, we often overview each at the exclusion of the individual parts. And so I think it might be helpful to think briefly about the sender, message, and receiver separately. So first, as we think about the sender, we might recall the linear model of communication. The linear model of communication suggests that communication operates in many ways like a pitcher and the audience like a glass. The speaker, with their pitcher, pours their knowledge or pours their information into the audience's vessels or glasses in such a way that there's limited spill and everybody is able to have a reciprocal transfer. However, in this sense, it leads to some questions about the role of the audience and the way that that message is inferred. Of course, we know from experience in real course lectures, there's some message spill. We forget some stuff, and that's okay, that's normal. That's the way that messages get transferred. There's a little bit of loss. And so, we should think a little bit about the way that that affects our understanding of the message before we then go on to consider the way that it might affect the receiver and audience. Scholars of persuasion believe that effectively organized messages can persuade audiences. And that's to say that it's not just the speaker sending those messages, but a well-crafted, a well-tailored messages in and of itself can actually get somebody to think differently about something than they had previously. Scholars of communication tend to believe that strong arguments have desirable consequences to their audiences. It gets them something they want. A high probability, a likelihood of recurring or otherwise being related to something they're interested in. And also something that's relevant and important, something that connects to the audience and something the audience is prone to caring about is likely going to get the audience wanting to argue or otherwise being more interested in accepting the argument proposed by the speaker, assuming it's in the vein of their pre-existing interests. And so in this sense, we've talked about message elaboration through the elaboration likelihood model in a previous lecture. Elaboration likelihood model suggests that some individuals are more likely to think carefully about a message based on their pre-existing motivations, or alternatively, use heuristics and mental shortcuts to avoid thinking carefully about a message. In this regard, we've described how different message complexities, whether those are two-sided messages which require cognitive thought, or whether or not they are presenting oppositional information which requires you to be able to debunk those arguments, all require some level of central route processing. Individuals have to think carefully about a two-sided message to understand the side being presented and the side being responded to and argued for. Finally, as we think not just about the source and the message, but also about the receiver, it's important to note that there are a number of different recipient factors or traits that might relate to audiences. And of course we can think about those audience characteristics as stable characteristics and what we might call trait factors, things that are likely to be permanent and not change over time. Those are things like demographics or your cognitive skills. Even things like personality traits, scholars of psychology and sociology have found that those don't fundamentally change over time. And so things like your religious belief system or things like your demographic categories aren't likely to shift in the context of a TED Talk. And so if we're seeking to measure whether that TED Talk was effective at persuading you, it wouldn't be all that helpful to think about whether those things are going to change throughout the course of that TED Talk. Instead, we might think about trait factors as permanent and enduring characteristics of the audience that we can strategically tailor messages to. Alternatively, in addition to trait factors, we also have what are known as state factors. State factors are dependent on the state of the audience in a particular moment. And in this regard, state factors are subject to change at a whim or in a moment's notice. We can think about state factors like the audience's mood. Perhaps we've just been to a comedy show and we've seen one comedian do a terrible job and make a joke that just ruins in front of an audience. Certainly that brings up a challenge for the next comedian who now needs to overcome the mood of the audience. And so the mood, subsequent and in short terms, might change throughout various different moments of a speech or throughout moments of an audience's existence. And so in this regard, things like the fatigue, the prior variable conditions that occur in the speech, or even feelings the audience might have of their own self-efficacy, their own ability to achieve the objectives of the speech, all might relate to whether or not the audiences, the receivers, are likely to be persuaded or not. So if you go on to work in a career which asks you to design and develop campaign materials for a social marketing campaign, you might think critically and carefully about the sender, message, receiver model of communication that we previously discussed. By thinking carefully about each of these factors, the sender, the message, and the receiver, marketers can develop better campaigns that influence audiences' attitudes and behaviors across a range of various different categories. And so in this sense, scholars of communication can study these different ranges of behaviors or these various different variables and appeals used to better be able to understand the trichotomy of communication. Previous research about social marketing campaigns has demonstrated that there is no single variable of persuasion or no one most effective method for being a social marketing campaign. Additionally, previous research related to social marketing campaigns has observed that it's difficult to measure attitude in the way that attitude changes over time. And so, while difficult to measure attitude and behavioral change, social marketing campaigns have turned towards looking at the various different strategies that campaigns use. In seeking to describe the different strategies that various campaigns have used through case studies, we've seen a fundamental shift in the way that scholars of communication approach social marketing campaigns. Where previously we sought to describe what was the best social marketing campaign and make predictive claims about how social marketing campaigns could do this to get this return, we now instead just do descriptive work which describes social marketing campaigns based on the relationships that they have forged, looking at various different case studies, saying things like, in this instance, these two things led to this outcome, rather than saying in every instance these lead to this outcome. This signifies a pretty fundamental shift in the way that communication theory approaches various different contexts like social marketing campaigns.